Tonight we're going to continue our Bible for Kids series, thinking about the kinds of truths we need to be imparting to our children and shaping their hearts and minds. And we use each month one of the memory verses that our kids in their classes go through quarter by quarter. And the text that they have been looking at most recently is found in Luke chapter 24, verses 5 and 6. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Spoken by an angel to the women who came to the tomb of our Savior. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no greater truth that our children need to know and have impressed in their minds than the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That's what they need to know about. And this lesson hopefully will try to address some issues surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. It's quite a claim, as I have said many, many times. And perhaps we because of our familiarity with it, we don't appreciate how incredible a claim it is that a man who died came back to life. So we're going to deal with some objections that are raised regarding the resurrection. To give you some context, though, to Luke's resurrection scene there in the text, we know that Jesus is crucified and he's buried. That's where the previous chapter ends. And we're going to talk some about the crucifixion tonight. But he's buried in the tomb that was given to him by Joseph of Arimathea. Women visit the tomb. Most prominently, they are identified in Luke's account. Later in the verses that follow the text that we're looking at tonight. And then angels proclaim the gospel. That's the gospel that he's risen. And they begin to grapple with what that means. And of course they go and tell the disciples, and it causes quite a stir. But I want to spend some time tonight talking about some evidence of the resurrection. I know we talked about 1 Corinthians 15 a couple of weeks ago at Easter. And we're going to rely on that, and I'm not going to preach that sermon to you again. That's not necessary because of the wealth of information there is surrounding this topic. And maybe hopefully tonight you'll get a sense of that. But because of the wealth of information surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, it can be somewhat difficult to know just where to start in trying to understand what happened, or even how to deal with very natural questions that come about regarding the resurrection of Jesus and if it really happened. So to do that, I'm going to use an approach that has been used by others and has been probably promoted mostly by Lee Strobel. Some of you may be familiar with him, and I think he has done some excellent work in laying out a very logical case. And he talks about the 4 E's of the resurrection. And I thought that especially in light of the fact that we're going to include this topic in our Bible for kids, that this would be a very helpful way for younger people to understand some very important points regarding the resurrection. So 4 E's of the resurrection. First of all, there is an execution. The first E is execution. We need to talk about the execution of Jesus. It's significant. Now we're not getting into the spiritual ramifications of his death. You're well familiar with that, and we're dealing with just the mere fact that he was crucified, that he died. One of the objections, of course, to the resurrection is, well, Jesus didn't die. And that explains why things unfolded the way they did. That explains why there was an empty tomb. He didn't die. That explains the appearances. he somehow survived crucifixion. And there's various shades of this point. You can read about, for example, the swoon theory, that somehow Jesus was near death, but as he was placed in this tomb because of the moisture in the air or the temperature of the room, that somehow he revived enough to leave the tomb. He didn't die. Well, let's talk about that. Did Jesus die? All of the Gospels, of course, very prominently point out the crucifixion. I'll tell you very simply that nobody survived a crucifixion. No one lived to tell the tale of their crucifixion. Very simply, it just didn't happen. No one survived crucifixion. A very common method of execution, of course, but it was a horrific way to die, a horrific execution. I've even pointed out in the past that Roman citizens legally could not be crucified. It was too horrific. If they were to be put to death, it would be in some other form. It would not be in the form of crucifixion. Crucifixion was designed to torture and to perhaps prolong death, mainly because the Romans wanted to send a message with crucifixion. The message was, you mess with Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. Now, there's some interesting details that are noted, particularly in the Gospel of John, regarding Jesus' crucifixion that are worth pointing out. Number one, I don't know if you have realized this, some of you maybe have, but John, the youngest of the disciples, John was the only apostle to witness the crucifixion of Jesus. All of the others left. And you remember the scenes in the garden and in the trial. John was brought into the trial, and there's lots of questions about how he was able to get into the trial. Perhaps he knew one of the officials. Maybe he snuck in. It's hard to know, but he was there, and he was at the foot of Jesus' cross. And he, in his gospel, describes what he saw. In John 19 and verses 31 to 35, since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was the high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. And he saw it and he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you may believe. John is saying, I saw this, he really died. And he gives specific details that account for his death. So to begin with, we see that because of the Sabbath, those bodies needed to be taken down, so that they needed to finish the execution. So to hasten death, the soldiers would come around and break the legs of the person hanging on the cross. You say, well, why would they do that? It's almost as if that would just cause more torture. Well, it certainly would have. But the way that a person ultimately would die by crucifixion was not because of nails. That would have been painful and designed to torture the victim, to keep them alive. They ultimately would die because they couldn't breathe. They would be suspended hanging there. And we know of what the torture that led up to Jesus being suspended on the cross. He had been flogged. An absolute horrible thing to have gone through. Many people wouldn't survive a flogging. Weakened beyond belief. When he was paraded through the streets, he was not able to even carry his own cross. Simon the Cyrenian had to come and carry the cross of Jesus. So he is in a weakened condition to begin with. How could he someone in that situation, how could they find enough strength to pull themselves up just enough to gasp for air? That's what someone nailed to a cross would have to do to stay alive. Pull themselves up just enough to gasp for air. Well, if your legs are broken, now you can't do that. Now, well, you're going to suffocate. Asphyxiation. Another thing that is pointed out here, now John is not trying to be, he's not trying to be gruesome or grotesque in what he describes, but he describes some things in graphic detail. So they break the legs of the two, but they come to Jesus and they see that he's already dead. So they're not going to break his legs. He's already died. But the soldier stabs him. Now, why does he do that? He does that, ladies and gentlemen, because no one survives a crucifixion. That's why the soldier is confirming that this man is dead. If he was still living, piercing him under the ribs and through the heart would finish the job. If he was already dead, it would be confirmed, wouldn't it? John says when he stabbed him, blood and water came out. Now you can read the American Medical Association's write-up on crucifixion, and they could give you a medical explanation about, well, why blood and water would come out when someone was pierced through the heart. When you can't breathe, fluid fills up in your lungs and around your heart. Do you know what would have happened to a Roman soldier if somebody would have survived crucifixion? Somebody would have run a spear through the Roman soldier's heart. It was their job. They were held responsible for seeing through to an execution. My point, Jesus was executed. Jesus died. And the evidence here in John bears that out. That accounts for the detail of his crucifixion. So if someone objects to the resurrection saying, well, he didn't really die, it's not plausible. It's not logical. Secondly, there's an empty tomb. There's an empty tomb. And really, much of the discussion surrounding the resurrection of Jesus coalesces around an empty tomb. Why? Why? Well, the best evidence. What's the best evidence that we have that the tomb was empty? Well, the best evidence for an empty tomb is not the women. It's not the disciples. The best evidence for the empty tomb is from the enemies of Jesus, who said the tomb was empty. No one disputed that the tomb was empty. So even if there is an enemy, well, they're conceding an important fact. They're conceding that the tomb is empty. So the tomb, before it was found empty, though, very unusual preparations were made for this tomb. The tomb was, you have it sealed with this stone. A Roman soldier was placed at the tomb. There was a seal of Rome placed on the tomb to guard it. Because what the Jews, what the enemies, what even the Romans accounted for is, well, the disciples said that he would raise in 3 days, so maybe they're going to come and steal his body to try to pull one over on us. So we're going to see that the tomb is guarded by a Roman soldier. The seal of Rome, they're essentially saying this tomb is the property of the Roman Empire. Guarded by a Roman soldier. Do you know, at the time, during this period of history, that the best trained soldiers in the world were Roman soldiers? Do you think a group of common fishermen could band together and take down a Roman soldier and steal a body? Now I want you to appreciate the significance of a Roman soldier. I mean, imagine a tomb today being stamped publicly, a public notice that this was the property of the United States government, guarded by a Marine. Do you think a group of longshoremen from down at the coast could steal something from a United States Marine? No, that doesn't seem plausible. That doesn't seem plausible. The body stolen? No. How do you account for an empty tomb when it was guarded by a Roman soldier? I mean, you can study the Roman soldiers. It's quite incredible. And what's, it's not just the armor that they had or the sword that they used or their spears or their shields. I mean, they were the weapon. The soldier was the weapon. The world had never seen a soldier like a Roman soldier, and that's what's standing outside the tomb of Jesus. Where did the body go? You'd say somebody's got some explaining to do. That there was an empty tomb. Some have said, well, maybe Jesus was never placed in that tomb. Did you ever think of that? Oh, people who were crucified, they weren't placed in tombs, they were placed in common graves. They weren't buried. Well, again, you can look. We've found skeletal remains of people who were crucified. You know how we know that they were crucified? Because they were buried with nails. So yes, men who were crucified, some of them were buried. Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's say that Jesus was placed in a common grave somewhere. Well, how do you explain the rest of the resurrection account? We're going to talk about some more of that. Listen, whatever explanation you want to give for the resurrection, you say the resurrection didn't happen. Whatever explanation you or someone else gives for that, you've got to account for everything that is described in the resurrection narrative. So how do you explain the witnesses? How do you explain some of the other details? No, saying that he was buried in a mass grave doesn't account for witnesses. It doesn't account for the rest of the story. There's an empty tomb. There's early accounts. Another E. The third E is early. Early accounts. Now this is mainly what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. When you look at 1 Corinthians 15, we talked about that's this early creedal statement, and Paul lays out a timeline for this message that Jesus died, was buried, and raised in accordance with the Scriptures. You know 1 Corinthians 15, and he was seen. And there's a witness list that is given there in that text. And when we take 1 Corinthians 15, and then you take the timeline that Paul lays out in Galatians 1 and 2, where he says, after I saw the resurrected Lord, and then I went into Arabia, then I went back home to Damascus, and then 3 years I went to Jerusalem, and I met with Peter for 15 days. So 3 years after his encounter with the risen Lord, he goes to Jerusalem and he meets with Peter for 15 days. Now, some would say that probably happened 3 to 5 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And some have said that may be where, that first meeting in Jerusalem with Peter may be where Paul got this creed. That could have been where he got that information. Most will concede that the creed itself that you have in 1 Corinthians 15 developed much earlier than that. James D.D. Dunn, who was a scholar, he would say that this probably developed 3 months to 1 year after Jesus was raised. And we talked about the importance of having a creedal statement. It's a concise way to carry the news. That if you don't have a statement like that develop early, then, that information doesn't get transmitted outside of Jerusalem. So you have this early creedal statement of 1 Corinthians 15. Well, what about the Gospels? The Gospels are also early accounts. They come later than 1 Corinthians 15, is what has traditionally been thought. Mark, I've told you before, Mark is the first Gospel that was written. John is the latest. And it has generally been thought that the four Gospels were written between 70 and 95 A.D. 70 to 95 A.D. That's not a long time removed from the resurrection. Now, some would say, Mark might have been written earlier than 70. Mark might have been written around 35 A.D. And if it was, that's fine with me, because that gets us even closer. Early accounts written within 50 years of the event? Is that reasonable? Does that mean that the accounts that we have can be reliably used? That they're trustworthy and accurate? In that lesson from a couple of weeks ago, I told you that we know about somebody like Alexander the Great because of the biographies of Arrian and Plutarch, who wrote them about 425 to 450 years after Alexander the Great died. But we have no problem. We have no problem believing anything that they wrote regarding those biographies. I think they're trustworthy and reliable. Well, what about the documentation that you have regarding the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And if that's true, you'd say that's the most significant event in the history of the world. Early accounts. Again, when we try to piece together what happened in ancient history, you will not find evidence that is as closely connected to when the event occurred than what you find regarding the resurrection of Jesus. Early accounts. Then you have the eyewitnesses, lastly. The eyewitnesses. They're significant. They're included in the creed. Isn't it interesting how the eyewitnesses, they knew. You can't just say Jesus died and was buried and raised the third day according to the Scriptures. You can't just say that. That's not enough. That's not enough. That's not going to hold up in court. You've got to have witnesses. Jesus appeared to people. Again, this is where you have got to account for some specifics. If you're going to deny the resurrection, how do you account for these eyewitnesses? In 1 Corinthians 15, there are 513 plus witnesses that are mentioned. 513. In the Gospels, you have the women that are documented. You have the apostles. The last chapters of all of the Gospels talk about these interactions that the disciples had with the risen Lord. Many of these witnesses eventually would die for their testimony. Do you know what you call a witness who dies for their testimony? Do you know that's called a martyr? A martyr. Martyr is not just somebody who dies for what they believe in. They die for what they believe they saw. $513. Now, in the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, it mentions the 500 men. 500 men. And I told you that the way that's described, number one, legally, women didn't have standing in court, and so that's why women are not the women are not part of the witness list in 1 Corinthians 15. Later, of course, they're mentioned. But the 500 men at once, I said that's a conservative number. There probably were women and children who were part of that. And if that's the case, then maybe it was 2,000 people at once. And let me tell you the importance of that. A lot of people will say, well, these witnesses, that these people who said that they saw Jesus, they are just grief-stricken. They're having hallucinations. They're having hallucinations. And so that's why they said that they saw what they said. It's just this, they're having hallucinations. So here's the problem with that. Do people hallucinate? Yes, people hallucinate. For a lot of different reasons. You know, maybe somebody has surgery and they're coming out of surgery after being on anesthesia and they're in the hospital and they see things crawling on the ceiling. It's a horrible feeling. People hallucinate for all kinds of reasons. Let me ask you this. Do two people hallucinate at the same time? Do 3 people hallucinate at the same time? Do 500 people hallucinate at the same time? No, they don't. And again, we've got a wealth of research on hallucinations. And what we know about them is that groups don't hallucinate. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, there are all kinds of things that have happened in the course of this world that groups have witnessed that absolutely defy explanation. And we could talk about some of these things that defy explanation, things that were witnessed by groups of people, modern examples. And just because you can't explain something, or just because something disrupts your worldview, doesn't mean that the claim is false. The question is, well, what happened? What did they see? And that's the value of the witnesses. Again, history's filled with unusual, unexplainable things witnessed by large groups of people, well-documented things. The chief among them being what we're talking about here tonight. There are lots of naturalistic explanations that have been given for the resurrection. And because of the passage of time, they've all been dealt with. Whatever question you might have, whatever objection you might raise about it, I can guarantee you it's been dealt with. We've really not scratched the surface with it tonight. The question is, if it happened, will you believe it? If Jesus was raised, if He was raised, God is real. If Jesus was raised, God is real. What the laws of physics, the laws of nature are suspended, are reversed. Not just in the miracles that Jesus performed, but when God raised Him from the dead. He's real. Our faith rests entirely upon this event. Now, you can look to other evidence about the existence of God, and that's all well and good. But the resurrection is the most important. All roads lead to this. It means everything. It means everything to everyone. Because it declares to us that we have a Creator. Someone who has the power to give life and to reverse death. Salvation is in Jesus alone. God is calling the world's attention to this man, to His Son, and our Savior, marking Him out by raising Him from the dead. So we must obey. There is no other rational response than to obey. Because He is the one who has power over everything. He has power over everything. So if we're not on His side, we don't stand a chance, do we? I hope tonight's lesson has been helpful, especially for those who are younger. You can look at a couple couple of E's, the 4 E's of the resurrection, and use that as a way to work your way through the evidence. If you're here tonight, believing in what we've talked about, believing in the resurrected Lord, and you'd like to obey Him, to give your life to Him, to seek His forgiveness, the opportunity is yours. He's waiting and ready to receive you if you'll obey Him. You can be baptized tonight to share in His death and resurrection, to leave here in the hope of eternal life. If we can help you be saved, we'd encourage you to come forward as together we stand and sing.